North Carolina, 1852. Snow began falling on Elias McCoy's half-finished cabin, and his neighbors couldn't believe what they were seeing. While every other settler built their cabins square and simple, foundation to roofline in perfect alignment, Elias was constructing something that looked ready to topple over. His second story hung 6 feet beyond his foundation, creating a structure so top-heavy that veteran carpenter Jacob Green openly scoffed, "It's gonna fall over the first time a wind gust hits that thing." The community called it an accident waiting to happen. They called him a fool for overcomplicating what should be straightforward. Elias had built a 16 by 20-foot cabin with an overhang so dramatic it defied every convention they knew about stable construction. Then came 1854. Torrential rains hammered the Appalachian region for days, 5 inches in 24 hours, creating flash floods that tested every structure in the valley. Standard cabins with exposed foundations began to rot and buckle as water pooled around their base logs. 20% of neighboring cabins suffered irreparable foundation damage. But that top-heavy cabin, it stood bone dry, its foundation completely protected by the very overhang everyone had mocked. What did Elias understand about water, weather, and structural engineering that an entire community of experienced builders had missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The autumn air in the Blue Ridge foothills carried the sharp scent of wood smoke and sawdust as Elias McCoy laid out his foundation stones in late September of 1852. Around him, the last wave of settlers hurried to complete their cabins before the mountain winter arrived, but Elias worked with deliberate precision that his neighbors found baffling. While they threw up standard 16 by 16-foot structures with foundations that matched their roof lines exactly, Elias had marked out something entirely different, a foundation that seemed too small for the cabin he claimed to be building. Jacob Green, the most experienced carpenter in the settlement, stopped his own work to watch Elias arrange the cornerstones. The foundation measured only 14 by 18 feet, yet Elias had told everyone he was building a 16 by 20-foot cabin. The mathematics made no sense to any of the settlers who had gathered to observe this peculiar construction method. "You marked it wrong, McCoy," Green called out, gesturing with his hammer toward the foundation. "That's going to leave you short on both ends." Elias looked up from his work, his hands covered in the red clay mortar he was using to set the stones. "Foundation's exactly where it needs to be," he replied, returning to his careful positioning of each cornerstone. He had selected the largest, flattest rocks from the creek bed, some weighing over 200 pounds, and arranged them with gaps precisely calculated to accommodate the drainage system he planned to build beneath the cabin floor. Word of the strange construction spread quickly through the small community. Margaret O'Neill, whose own cabin foundation had been laid in the conventional manner just 2 weeks earlier, walked over with several other women to see what Elias was attempting. "Never seen anyone start a cabin like that," she said, studying the foundation that appeared to float in the middle of the cleared space, rather than filling it corner to corner, as every other structure in the settlement had done. As October arrived and Elias began raising his walls, the true nature of his design became apparent. The lower level rose normally from the foundation stones, creating a solid 14 by 18-foot structure with walls of carefully notched oak logs, each one hand-selected for straightness and minimal taper. But when he reached the height of 8 feet and began laying the floor joists for his second story, neighbors gathered in disbelief. The joists extended 3 feet beyond the foundation on the front and back of the cabin, and 2 feet beyond the sides, creating a framework that seemed to hover in midair. "That thing's gonna come down in the first windstorm," declared Thomas Whitfield, whose own cabin stood completed just 50 yards away. "No foundation under half that second floor. It's hanging on nothing but air and wishful thinking." The other men nodded in agreement, having never seen a structure where the upper level extended so dramatically beyond the base. In their experience, buildings grew from the ground up in perfect vertical alignment, each level supported directly by the one beneath it. Elias continued his work without responding to the criticism. He understood what his neighbors could not see, that the massive oak sill beams he had selected were capable of carrying far more weight than a simple cabin would ever place on them. Each beam measured 12 inches by 14 inches in cross-section, nearly twice the size of the timbers other settlers used, and he had mortised and tenoned every joint with the precision his grandfather had taught him in the mountains of Virginia. The cantilever principle was not new to him. He had seen it employed in the old German barns of Pennsylvania, and in the ancient structures his Cherokee neighbors had shown him in hidden valleys deeper in the mountains. By November, as Elias raised the walls of his second story, the visual impact of his design became even more dramatic. The upper level now clearly overhung the foundation by 6 feet on the front, creating a structure that appeared impossibly top-heavy to anyone accustomed to conventional building methods. Children from neighboring families came to stare at the cabin that looked ready to tip forward, while their parents shook their heads and predicted disaster. "It's an abomination," pronounced Samuel Richardson, the settlement's unofficial leader and most successful farmer. "Building's supposed to rest on its foundation, not hang out in space like that. Man's wasting good timber on a structure that won't last till Christmas." Richardson's own cabin, completed in early October using traditional methods, had cost him considerably less in materials and labor, built with the standard practice of placing each wall directly atop the foundation stones with no overhang whatsoever. The technical challenges of Elias's approach were visible to anyone who understood construction. The cantilever placed enormous stress on the connection points where the overhanging beams met the foundation level, requiring joinery techniques that most frontier builders had never attempted. While his neighbors used simple notching and spiking for their connections, Elias employed complex mortise and tenon joints secured with massive oak pegs driven through carefully drilled holes. Each connection took him hours to complete, while conventional builders finished similar joints in minutes. As winter approached and Elias worked to complete his roof, the mockery intensified. His choice to build the chimney in the center of the structure rather than against one wall struck his neighbors as another inexplicable decision. "Waste of space and materials," Green observed, watching Elias construct a stone chimney that required careful positioning to serve both levels of his unconventional design. "Chimney belongs on the wall where it's easy to build and doesn't eat up your floor space." The settlement buzzed with predictions of failure. Some wagered that the first heavy snow would collapse the overhanging second story. Others insisted that spring winds would topple the entire structure. A few suggested that Elias's apparent expertise in carpentry was merely the delusion of a man who had read too many books and understood too little about the practical realities of frontier construction. What none of them realized was that Elias was building not just for immediate shelter, but for a battle against forces that would test every structure in the valley within 2 short years. The spring of 1854 arrived with deceptive gentleness in the Blue Ridge foothills. Elias McCoy's controversial cabin had survived its first winter without incident, though his neighbors attributed this more to luck than to sound engineering. The structure's dramatic overhang had shed snow efficiently, and the interior had remained comfortable throughout the coldest months. But skeptics like Jacob Green maintained that the real test would come when serious weather arrived. They would not have to wait long. By early June, the seasonal rains that typically brought relief to the mountain region began with unusual intensity. What started as normal afternoon thunderstorms evolved into something far more serious as weather. Patterns stalled over the Appalachian range. The first indication of trouble came on June 15th, when a storm system that should have moved through in hours instead settled over the valley and remained for 3 days straight. Rain fell in sheets so dense that visibility dropped to mere yards, and the normally placid creek that ran behind the settlement swelled to twice its usual width. Thomas Whitfield was the first to notice water seeping through the foundation of his cabin. Built according to conventional methods, with foundation stones placed directly beneath each wall, his structure offered no protection for the base logs that rested on the stone piers. As rainwater ran off his roof, it struck the ground and immediately pooled around the foundation, soaking into the oak sills that formed the bottom course of his walls. "Just a little dampness," he told his wife, Sarah, as they moved their stored grain to higher shelves. "Soon as this weather passes, everything will dry out." Margaret O'Neill faced similar problems at her newly completed cabin. The logs that formed her foundation course, positioned in the traditional manner flush with the edge of her stone foundation, began absorbing water from the saturated ground beneath and the constant runoff from above. Her husband had died before completing proper drainage around the structure, leaving the foundation vulnerable to exactly the kind of prolonged moisture that now threatened every conventional cabin in the settlement. Samuel Richardson, whose confident predictions about Elias's folly had made him the unofficial spokesman for traditional building methods, discovered water damage in his own cabin on the fourth day of rain. The bottom logs on the north side of his structure, where runoff collected most heavily, showed dark stains that indicated moisture penetration deep into the wood. "Nothing that won't fix itself when the sun comes out," he declared to anyone who would listen, though privately he had begun moving his most valuable possessions away from the affected walls. The rain continued for 6 more days, transforming the landscape in ways that longtime residents had never witnessed. The creek rose 4 feet above its normal level, turning the narrow waterway into a rushing torrent that carried away fence posts and lumber from several homesteads. Ground that had never held standing water became a network of temporary streams and ponds, creating drainage patterns that no one had anticipated when selecting cabin sites. On June 21st, the storm intensified beyond anything in local memory. 5 inches of rain fell in a single 24-hour period, overwhelming every natural and man-made drainage system in the valley. Water that normally soaked into the forest floor now ran in torrents down every slope, converging in areas where cabins had been built without consideration for such extreme conditions. Flash floods struck 3 different locations in the settlement, carrying away livestock, tools, and everything else that had not been secured well above ground level. Jacob Green's cabin, built with meticulous craftsmanship according to every traditional method he had learned in 30 years of carpentry, suffered damage that shocked him to his core. The foundation logs on his south wall, exposed to the full force of water running off his roof, had absorbed so much moisture that they began to swell and separate at the joints. When he pressed his thumb against the wood, it left a permanent indentation in what had been solid oak just 2 weeks earlier. The rot had penetrated nearly 2 inches into timbers that should have remained sound for decades. The crisis deepened as temperatures dropped unexpectedly on June 24th, creating conditions that trapped moisture in every piece of wood throughout the settlement. Cabins that might have dried out quickly in normal summer heat instead retained water in their structural members, accelerating the decay process that would normally take years to develop. Green watched in dismay as fungal growth appeared on his cabin walls within days, spreading across the interior surfaces in patterns he had never seen in properly constructed buildings. At Margaret O'Neill's cabin, the situation became desperate. The foundation logs had absorbed so much water that the entire structure began to settle unevenly, creating gaps between the wall logs that admitted both water and cold air. Her carefully chinked walls, sealed with clay and moss according to standard practice, cracked and fell away as the logs shifted, leaving her with a shelter that provided little protection from the elements. She spent sleepless nights listening to water drip through gaps that widened with each passing hour. Throughout the settlement, similar scenes of structural failure played out as the prolonged moisture exposed the fundamental vulnerability of conventional cabin construction. Richardson's cabin developed a permanent lean as the foundation logs on one side compressed under the weight of water-saturated timber above. Whitfield's structure remained level, but lost much of its structural integrity as the bottom course of logs began to crumble where they met the foundation stones. Yet in the midst of this widespread devastation, one structure stood completely unaffected by the conditions that had damaged every other building in the settlement. Elias McCoy's cabin, with its 6-foot overhang protecting the foundation from any direct contact with rainwater, remained as solid and dry as the day it was completed. The foundation stones showed no signs of moisture, the base logs retained their original color and hardness, and the interior stayed comfortable regardless of the chaos surrounding it. Neighbors who had mocked the cantilever design now found themselves studying it with new interest. The overhang that had seemed so structurally unsound now revealed its purpose as water cascaded harmlessly away from the foundation, never allowing moisture to collect where it could damage the crucial connection between stone and timber. What they had dismissed as overengineering now appeared to be the only approach that had anticipated the realities of mountain weather. The morning after the floods receded, Jacob Green stood in his doorway, surveying damage that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. His carefully crafted cabin, built with joints he had perfected over 3 decades of carpentry, now leaned visibly to the south where the foundation logs had compressed under constant moisture. When he pressed his boot against the affected wall, the entire structure flexed in ways that solid timber construction never should. The realization that his expertise had failed him in such a fundamental way left him staring across the settlement toward the one building that remained perfectly intact. Elias McCoy emerged from his cabin that same morning to find a small crowd gathered at the edge of his property. Thomas Whitfield stood among them, his face bearing the exhaustion of sleepless nights spent listening to his own cabin settle and crack. Margaret O'Neill clutched a shawl around her shoulders, having spent the previous evening moving her belongings away from walls that leaked despite every traditional chinking method she knew. Samuel Richardson maintained his distance from the group, but his eyes remained fixed on the structure he had once dismissed as an abomination. "How'd you know?" Whitfield asked without preamble, gesturing toward his own cabin where gaps between the logs now admitted daylight in places that had been sealed tight just a month before. "How'd you know the water would do this to the foundations?" His question carried none of the mockery that had characterized previous conversations about Elias's building methods, replaced instead by the desperate need to understand what had gone wrong with his own construction. Elias walked to the edge of his foundation and knelt beside one of the massive cornerstones, running his hand along the base log that rested upon it. The oak remained as solid and dry as the day he had positioned it, showing no signs of the moisture damage that had devastated every other structure in the settlement. "Water always wins," he said simply, looking up at the faces surrounding him. "You can fight it for a while, but eventually it finds every weakness in what you've built." Margaret O'Neill stepped closer, studying the 6-foot overhang that had seemed so unnecessary when Elias first constructed it. "But how does hanging the cabin out in space like that keep water away from down here?" she asked, pointing to the foundation stones that remained completely dry despite weeks of unprecedented rainfall. Her own foundation, built according to every conventional method she had learned, showed clear signs of water damage around every pier. The explanation that followed would reshape building practices throughout the region for generations to come. Elias demonstrated how rainwater striking his roof was carried by gutters and natural drainage patterns far beyond the foundation perimeter, never allowing moisture to collect where it could seep into the critical junction between stone and timber. The conventional cabins, with their roof lines positioned directly above their foundations, created a perfect system for concentrating water exactly where structural damage would be most severe. Jacob Green examined the joinery that supported the cantilever, running his experienced hands along the massive mortise and tenon connections that had seemed so unnecessarily complex during construction. Each joint remained tight and true, despite supporting loads that his own simpler connections could never have handled. "These timbers are twice the size of what I used," he admitted, measuring the 12 by 14-inch beams against the 8 by 10-inch standards he had employed in his own work. "But I thought you were just wasting lumber." The gathering crowd grew as word spread that Elias was explaining his construction methods to anyone interested in learning. Amos Turner, the region's other experienced carpenter, arrived with a measuring stick and notebook, determined to document techniques that had proven themselves superior to everything he had been taught. "Show me how you calculated the loads on these connections," he requested, studying the complex joinery that distributed the weight of the overhanging structure across the foundation with mathematical precision. What emerged from these discussions was a comprehensive understanding of building science that went far beyond the simple craft knowledge that had guided frontier construction for decades. Elias revealed that his approach addressed multiple challenges simultaneously: moisture protection, structural stability, thermal efficiency, and long-term durability. The center-position chimney that neighbors had criticized as wasteful actually provided more even heat distribution while reducing the structural complications of building a flue through an overhanging wall. By afternoon, practical demonstrations had begun as Elias showed his neighbors how to retrofit existing structures with protective overhangs. Margaret O'Neill's cabin became the first test case, with Elias designing a modified cantilever system that could be added to her existing walls without requiring complete reconstruction. The project required extending her existing roof beams and adding support timbers, but the engineering principles remained the same as those employed in his original design. The technical precision required for such modifications quickly became apparent to everyone involved in the work. Unlike simple cabin construction, the cantilever method demanded exact calculations of load distribution, precise joinery techniques, and careful attention to the interaction between different structural elements. Samuel Richardson, working alongside Elias to repair his own foundation damage, discovered that successful implementation required abandoning much of what he thought he knew about frontier building methods. Word of the construction innovation spread beyond the immediate settlement, as travelers and traders carried accounts of the unusual building techniques to neighboring communities. Within months, inquiries arrived from as far away as Tennessee and Virginia, asking for details about the cantilever method that had protected structures during the Great Floods of 1854. Elias found himself corresponding with builders throughout the Appalachian region, sharing technical drawings and load calculations that codified knowledge he had previously passed on only through direct demonstration. The transformation of local building practices accelerated as the practical advantages of the cantilever design became undeniable. Jacob Green rebuilt his own cabin using Elias's methods, extending the second story 8 feet beyond the foundation and employing the massive timber connections that had initially seemed so excessive. Amos Turner incorporated cantilever elements into a new barn project, discovering that the same principles that protected cabin foundations also prevented moisture damage to stored grain and livestock shelters. By winter's end, the settlement that had once mocked Elias McCoy's unconventional approach had become a center for innovative building techniques that attracted visitors from throughout the mountain region. The crisis that had exposed the limitations of traditional methods had also created an opportunity for knowledge transfer that would influence Appalachian architecture for generations to come. 25 years passed in the Blue Ridge foothills, and the settlement that had once questioned Elias McCoy's building methods now stood as a testament to their enduring value. By 1879, every structure built according to conventional methods from the early days had been rebuilt at least once, while Elias's original cabin remained as solid as the day its final timber was set in place. The massive oak beams that supported his cantilever showed no signs of sagging, the foundation stones had never shifted, and the base logs retained their original hardness and color despite decades of mountain weather. Hannah McCoy, now a woman of 32 with children of her own, had grown up understanding the cabin not as an oddity, but as the standard by which all other buildings should be measured. She remembered the floods of 1854 only as stories her father told, but she had witnessed countless smaller tests of the structure's resilience. Ice storms that brought down trees throughout the valley never touched her family's foundation. Summer droughts that cracked the foundations of neighboring buildings left their stone piers unaffected. Winter freezes that split conventional timber connections had no impact on the carefully engineered joints that distributed loads across the cantilever system. The technical superiority of the design had attracted attention from beyond the immediate region as word spread through networks of craftsmen, engineers, and architects working throughout the expanding American frontier. In 1876, a delegation from the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition traveled to North Carolina specifically to document the construction methods that had proven so remarkably durable. They measured every timber, sketched every joint, and recorded the load calculations that Elias had refined through decades of observation and modification. Professor James Mitchell of the Virginia Military Institute arrived in 1878 with surveying equipment and a commission from the federal government to study innovative building techniques suitable for military construction in challenging environments. His examination of Elias's cabin lasted 3 weeks and resulted in detailed technical drawings that would influence the design of frontier forts and government buildings throughout the Western Territories. The cantilever principle as applied here, Mitchell wrote in his official report, demonstrates load distribution capabilities superior to conventional construction while providing weather protection that extends structural life by decades. The mathematical precision underlying the design impressed even experienced engineers who had initially dismissed frontier building methods as crude approximations of proper construction techniques. Elias's calculations for load distribution across the cantilever beams proved accurate to within percentages that matched the best theoretical work being done at Eastern universities. His understanding of moisture dynamics and thermal expansion coefficients had been derived through practical observation rather than academic study, yet his conclusions aligned perfectly with the emerging science of structural engineering. Margaret O'Neill, whose cabin had been the first to benefit from retrofitted cantilever modifications, became an unofficial chronicler of the techniques spread throughout the region. By 1880, she could identify 43 structures within a 20-mile radius that employed some variation of Elias's methods. Barns, cabins, mills, and even church buildings had been designed with protective overhangs and center-positioned chimneys that reflected the principles he had demonstrated during the crisis of 1854. The economic impact of the construction innovations extended far beyond individual building projects, as communities throughout Appalachia discovered that structures built using cantilever methods required significantly less maintenance and lasted far longer than conventional buildings. Jacob Green, who had become one of the most skilled practitioners of the technique, calculated that his cantilever-designed buildings typically lasted 40 to 50 years without major repairs compared to the 15 to 20-year lifespans of traditionally constructed cabins. Amos Turner had established what amounted to a school of cantilever construction, teaching the complex joinery techniques and load calculations to apprentice carpenters from throughout the southeastern mountains. His students carried the methods to Kentucky, Tennessee, and Georgia, where local variations evolved to address specific regional challenges while maintaining the core principles of moisture protection and structural stability that made the approach so effective. The preservation of traditional knowledge through practical application became a defining characteristic of the cantilever building movement, as craftsmen discovered that the technique required not just understanding of construction methods, but also deep familiarity with local materials, weather patterns, and site conditions. Elias's original insights about working with natural forces, rather than against them, proved applicable to diverse environments, but successful implementation demanded the kind of observational skills that could only be developed through direct experience with specific locations and conditions. By 1885, architectural historians from as far away as Boston and Chicago had begun documenting what they termed Appalachian vernacular innovation, recognizing that the cantilever techniques developed in small mountain settlements represented genuine advances in structural engineering rather than merely regional building curiosities. Harvard University's School of Architecture acquired detailed drawings of Elias's cabin for inclusion in their collection of significant American building designs, placing his work alongside examples of the most sophisticated urban construction of the era. The social transformation that accompanied the spread of cantilever construction methods reflected broader changes in how frontier communities approached the relationship between traditional knowledge and technical innovation. Rather than viewing Elias's methods as departures from established practice, builders throughout the region came to understand them as refinements of ancient principles that had been temporarily forgotten in the rush to establish quick, inexpensive shelter. Thomas Whitfield's son, who had learned carpentry from both his father and Elias McCoy, represented a new generation of builders who combined the speed and simplicity of conventional methods with the durability and weather resistance of cantilever design. His hybrid approach, employing protective overhangs on critical exposures while maintaining traditional construction elsewhere, proved especially popular for larger buildings where full cantilever implementation would have been prohibitively expensive. The cabin that had once seemed destined to collapse in the first windstorm now stood as the centerpiece of a settlement that had become known throughout the region for the quality and longevity of its buildings. Visitors often expressed amazement that a structure which appeared so precarious from certain angles could demonstrate such remarkable stability over decades of service. The visual paradox of the cantilever design, seemingly unstable yet actually more secure than conventional construction, served as a constant reminder that appearances could be misleading when evaluating engineering solutions. The morning of September the 23rd, 1952, brought federal surveyors to the Blue Ridge settlement for the first time in decades. They arrived with theodolites and measuring chains, tasked with documenting structures of historical significance as part of the National Historic Preservation Survey. Among the buildings they had come to examine, one stood out for reasons that had nothing to do with its age or architectural beauty. Elias McCoy's cabin, now exactly 100 years old, remained structurally sound and fully occupied by his great-granddaughter, Ruth McCoy Harrison, who had inherited not only the building but also the detailed construction records her family had maintained across 4 generations. The lead surveyor, Robert Kellerman from the National Park Service, had studied photographs of the cabin before making the journey from Washington, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of examining a century-old structure that showed fewer signs of wear than most buildings constructed within the previous decade. The foundation stones remained perfectly level and unmoved from their original positions. The cantilever beams showed no deflection despite supporting loads they had carried for 10 decades. Most remarkably, the base logs that formed the critical connection between stone and timber retained their structural integrity without any signs of the rot that had claimed every other building from the original settlement. Ruth Harrison had grown up hearing stories about the cabin's construction from her grandfather, who had been present during the floods of 1854 and witnessed the vindication of techniques that neighbors had initially mocked. She maintained comprehensive documentation that included original timber measurements, load calculations, and modification records spanning the entire century of the building's existence. "Nothing's ever needed replacing," she explained to the surveyors as they examined the massive mortise and tenon joints that supported the cantilever. "Grandpa Elias built it to last, and it's done exactly that." The technical examination revealed engineering principles that had proven far ahead of their time. Kellerman's measurements confirmed that the cantilever system distributed loads with mathematical precision that matched the most sophisticated structural calculations of the 1950s. The 6-foot overhang that had seemed so dramatically unstable to 19th century observers now appeared to demonstrate an intuitive understanding of structural mechanics that had taken academic engineering decades to codify. Load stress analysis using modern equipment showed that the system operated well within safe parameters despite carrying weights that would have exceeded the capacity of conventional frontier construction methods. Professor William Chen from North Carolina. State University's School of Engineering joined the survey team for the final week of documentation, bringing instruments capable of measuring stress patterns and material fatigue with unprecedented precision. His analysis of the oak timbers revealed wood that had actually grown stronger over time as natural curing processes had increased its density and load-bearing capacity. The cantilever beams showed stress patterns consistent with optimal engineering design, with forces distributed evenly across connections that had been hand-cut with tools available to frontier craftsmen a century earlier. The preservation of the cabin's technical documentation proved as remarkable as the structure itself. 4 generations of McCoy family members had maintained detailed records of every modification, repair, and improvement made to the building over its century of existence. These records revealed that the original design had required only minor adjustments during its entire service life, with most modifications consisting of cosmetic improvements rather than structural repairs. The roof had been reshingled 3 times, interior walls had been refinished periodically, and modern conveniences had been added, but the fundamental structural elements remained unchanged from Elias McCoy's original construction. The broader historical significance of the cabin became clear as researchers discovered its influence on building practices throughout the Appalachian region and beyond. Government records from the late 19th century revealed that cantilever construction methods derived from Elias's techniques had been employed in military installations, railroad structures, and public buildings across the expanding western frontier. The technical principles he had developed to protect a single-family cabin from mountain weather had evolved into engineering standards that influenced American construction practices well into the 20th century. Archaeological investigation of the surrounding settlement provided stark contrast to the durability of the McCoy cabin. Foundation stones from buildings constructed using conventional methods showed clear evidence of water damage, structural failure, and repeated reconstruction. Site analysis revealed that every other structure from the original 1850s settlement had been rebuilt at least twice, with many locations showing evidence of 3 or 4 successive buildings constructed on the same foundations. Only the McCoy cabin had provided continuous habitation without requiring major reconstruction. The economic analysis conducted by the survey team demonstrated the long-term financial wisdom of Elias's approach to construction. While his original investment in materials and labor had exceeded that of his neighbors by approximately 30%, the total cost of ownership over 100 years proved significantly lower than conventional buildings that required periodic reconstruction. Ruth Harrison's family had spent less on structural maintenance during the cabin's entire century of existence than most homeowners invested in routine repairs over single decades. Documentation of the construction techniques for inclusion in the National Archives required detailed photography and measurement of joinery methods that had been considered revolutionary in their time, but were now recognized as sophisticated applications of engineering principles. The massive timber connections that had seemed excessive to 19th century observers proved to incorporate safety factors and load distribution strategies that aligned perfectly with modern structural engineering standards. Federal engineers concluded that the building methods employed in the cabin's construction were technically superior to many approaches being used in contemporary residential construction. The final survey report, completed in December of 1952, designated the McCoy cabin as a National Historic Landmark based not only on its age, but on its demonstration of innovative engineering principles that had influenced American building practices for over half a century. The structure that had once been dismissed as the folly of an overly cautious immigrant now stood as official recognition of frontier ingenuity that had produced solutions superior to the conventional wisdom of its era. Ruth Harrison continued to live in the cabin until her death in 1978, after which it was donated to the National Park Service for preservation as a demonstration of 19th century construction innovation. The building that Elias McCoy had designed to shelter his family through mountain winters had become a testament to the enduring value of practical wisdom, careful observation, and the courage to challenge accepted methods when better approaches could be proven through results.